Hi friends, glad to welcome you back to another weekly edition of Quick Tip video brought to you by dataplatformcentral.com. So in this week we are continuing our series of Azure Data Factory based tips. This week we are going to show you a demo of a quick tip which will help you to utilize Graph API of Microsoft Azure services to extract information from your Azure Active Directory. Quite often in your projects, you might have come across some migration scenarios where you would require extracting information from your Azure Active Directory regarding users, user groups, etc. Though Azure Data Factory comes with standard connector which you can use for connecting to your Office 365 and extract this information, there is a much easier way to get this information using a REST based endpoint. This uses a Graph API provided by Microsoft which exposes this information which you can call through a REST API endpoint. And in one of our recent projects, by using Graph API, we could obtain a much better performance compared to using the standard Office 365 connector which got shipped with Azure Data Factory. So this Graph API method would come handy to you in many situations where you want to extract such useful bit of information from many Microsoft services. Recent times, Graph API is getting integrated with many Microsoft services so that you can use this as a consistent method for connecting to the REST endpoints of many Microsoft based Azure services. Now without wasting any more time, let's quickly go and see how we can set up a quick demo for extracting the required user information from your Azure Active Directory using this Graph API. To start off this demonstration, let's go to Azure portal, and now we are going to first create a pipeline inside our Azure Data Factory or Synapse pipeline. So for the sake of this demo, I already have a Azure Synapse Analytics workspace set up, and I'll be using the Synapse pipeline component for creating the pipelines. This is because in this case our intention is to extract this data which is coming from your Azure Active Directory and push it to a table that you are going to maintain inside your Synapse. Because you are already on Synapse, it makes sense for you to use a Synapse pipeline component rather than provisioning a separate Azure Data Factory instance. Since both these are one and the same, the method that is followed here can be applied the same way to your Azure Data Factory instance as well. So let's go to the Azure Synapse Analytics and let's go to the de facto development environment for Azure Synapse, which is your Synapse Studio. So once you are inside the Synapse Studio, now we are going to create a pipeline for extracting the AD information using Graph API. So now that we are inside the Synapse Studio, before we start the pipeline, we need to first create a linked service which can be used for connecting to your Azure Active Directory using Graph API REST endpoint. So let's go to the Manage tab for that, and in the Manage tab you have the linked services. So from here you can click on New, and we are going to use a REST API endpoint. So we need to search for REST API inside the search box. So once you search for REST, it will show you the REST type of linked service. So click on Continue, and this is where we need to understand that for connecting to a REST API, we need to first give the base URL. So what would be the base URL in this case? The base URL, there are two REST endpoints which are provided by Graph API. One is the normal graph.microsoft.com/version 1.0 API, and the second version is the beta API which is currently in beta. So for getting an idea on this, you can go to the Explorer page for Graph API. You can search for the Explorer page and it will take you to the Explorer page for Graph API. So this represents the Explorer page for the Graph API, and you can see that there are two versions of the APIs. One is the version 1.0 and the second one is the beta version which is currently in testing. So we will first see what properties are exposed by the version 1.0, and then after that let's also see what is in offer for beta. As of now, beta is in testing, so it's not recommended to use beta in a production environment. So let's go back and try to put in this URL. All except the last part will be the URL. Put it inside your linked service, and this will be the base URL. And then once you want, you are going to authenticate using a service principal. So when you try to use a service principal, it will ask you for an app ID and the app key. So you need to generate an app ID and an app key before you come here and create the linked service. So let's go back to the portal, and for this we need to create an app. And for creating the app, you can go to the app registrations service, which is available inside your Azure. Now click on the new registration, and you are going to just define a new app which we call as the Graph API app. And you can leave the rest of the properties to the default, that is accounts in this organization directory, and you can click on register. So now wait for a while, during which the application will get registered. So once the application is getting registered, you know that it has an app ID now. Now you need to generate a secret. So if you go back to your linked service, it is asking for a principal ID, which will be your application ID, and it will be asking for a key, which will be your client secret. So come back to your app. The app ID is already there. For secrets, you have the certificates and secrets. So you need to go there and generate a secret for this app. Before you do that, you need to give access to this app for accessing the Graph API. For that purpose, you have this API permissions. Go to the API permissions tab, and here we will be giving it access to Microsoft Graph. By default, it will have, the user will have a read access for Microsoft Graph, but you need to add two more accesses to this. One is read all, and the second one is directory.readall. So you need to click on add a permission, and you need to select Microsoft Graph and go to application permissions, and it will list you all the properties which are coming under application permissions. So you can search for here on the required properties. So first thing is you need to search for directory, and inside directory you have directory read all. You can select directory read all, and then the second one would be the user. Now go to similarly inside user and select the user.read.all. These are the two permissions you need to add to this. Now you can see all the permissions are listed here. Now if you see this, the new permissions are not granted for your own account. So to make sure that these permissions are granted to your own account, you can click on the grant admin consent button on top and click on yes in the confirmation box, and wait for a while, and it will get applied to your own account. So now it's possible for you to use this application to access the Graph APIs. Now you just go to the certificate and secrets, and you need to generate a new client secret. Just give it some description, like you can just give it Graph API secret and click on add, and automatically the secret will get generated. This is the only time when you'll be seeing the secret, so make sure you're copying it and noting it down on some notepad or something. So this is your secret, and your app ID, you can go to the overview page and copy it from here. So that will be your app ID, and now you have the secret as well. Once you have these two, you can come back to your linked service, and in that principal ID you can put in this app ID which you have copied second, and for the key you can copy the client secret which you generate, and the tenant ID will be by default populated, and AD resource will be still the same thing, which is graph.microsoft.com without the version of that API. So just copy and paste it. Once you do all these things and click on test connection, assuming that you have registered your app properly and given the permissions, the connection will be successful. Now you can just give it a meaningful name. So you can name it, instead of REST service, you can name it Graph API. So once that linked service is created, you can click on create to create that Graph API linked service. So this completes your first part of setting up the linked service to connect to the Graph API. Now you need to go to the integrate option, and you are going to create a new pipeline which is going to use this linked service to connect to the Graph API and get the user information. So for that, open the pipeline and go to the move and transform, and you can see the copy data activity percent here. You can go to the copy data, go to the source, and you are going to create a new source which is going to connect to your API. So for that purpose, what is the source here? The source here would be actually a REST API, right? So again you have to select a REST based dataset. Select the REST one and click on continue, and it will ask you to select a linked service. You already have the Graph API linked service which you have created now. Select that and click on OK. So automatically, if you see, it will take the type of the request method as get. Some cases it will be get, some cases it will be post. Here it will be a get method itself. This you can confirm by going back to the Graph Explorer. You see that you are going to basically you are giving a get option here. So you can try calling the same API through this and see what it gives us a result. It will give you some sample result here, which will indicate that this is the exact way in which you need to call the API. So for all this documentation is available like a sandbox kind of environment here. You can try it out here in this Explorer, and once you are sure on this, you can then come back to your pipeline to put in. So now that you have put the source, now one thing here you need to do is that you have only given the base URL, okay, but here you need the user information. So if you see the URL here, it is /users. So that /users you need to take it and add it as a relative URL. So copy this and you can put it as a relative URL here. But to make it more flexible, what we could also do is like we can add a parameter here, so that you can pass any endpoints like users, groups, etc. The same linked service can be used for getting multiple information. So for that purpose, let's add a parameter, and I'm going to name the parameter as relative URL, and I'm going to set the value as this static value for now, but in the actual case it will come from the place where you call it, that is from within your pipeline. So I'm just going to map to this parameter that I've added here, and once you go back to the pipeline, then it will ask you for the actual value. So in this case, now I can set the same value itself. Based on what you want, you can change it, users, groups, etc. Request method is get, so you don't have to change anything there. One thing here is that when you are calling the Graph API, in case your result goes beyond 1000 records, it will apply the automatic pagination on like different pages. So to make sure that you are returning the result from every one of those pages, you need to add a pagination rule here. So what you need to do is like add one item here to make sure that it is paginating it. So for paginating, just add the absolute URL and just add the odata.next link as the value for it. So once you add this, the pagination will be automatically taken care of by this API call. So now that you have added it, response will be in JSON format. You can put it as a JSON or you can put it as a Parquet. In most cases, Parquet will be much easier to work with in case you want to get the data and push it onto other side. So in this case, because you are going to push it to Synapse, let's try to dump it into a Parquet file so that we'll get it in columnar compressed format with the required data type information. So let's click on new for that, and we are going to push it to a Parquet file. So let's push it to a data lake storage, Gen2 storage, which is associated with my Synapse account, and inside that I am going to put it in Parquet format. So click on continue, and then you need to create a linked service for the Parquet. You can link to the default storage which is associated to your Synapse, and then you can map it to a folder. I have set up a folder called Graph API users, so you can map it to that folder and click on OK. So automatically the data will be extracted in Parquet format inside this folder. Now click on OK. Now in the mapping, you can click on import schemas. So it will try to import the schema from your source. So now once you have set your sync as the Parquet file, go to the mapping tab and click on import schemas. It will try to import the schema from your source file. So because it's coming as a JSON file, you need to iterate through each of the JSON elements. So select the JSON array and click on max complex values to string and click on import schemas, and then you can whatever things you want, you can put it inside, and whichever information is not required, you can take it. So as of now I am trying to return the user based information, so I will only select the user based information, and you can set the corresponding data types as well. And so all the data types have been set for the columns. Now it's okay for us to start trying the execution. So let's first try to run this in debug mode and see what happens. First let's validate it. So there are no validation errors. So now that there are no validation errors, let's try running it in debug mode. So now that the debug mode is successful, it took around like just 12 seconds because there is not much users in my tenant. So let's go back and check. So currently if you see my tenant, I have only like 1 2 3 4 5 users here. So these are the 5 user informations which it will be extracting to my data lake. So if you go to my data lake and refresh it, you can see that file, which is the Parquet file, which is created with this user information. So if you go to edit, you can see that the Parquet file has found, but it is not in any kind of readable format. So now what we need to do is that we need to add one more copy activity so as to get the data from this Parquet file onto a table inside Synapse, and then let's check if we are getting the user information correctly. For this purpose, let's add one more copy data which will use this Parquet file as the source, and then let's map it to a table that we are creating inside Azure Synapse Analytics. Since it's beyond the scope of this article, I'm not going to explain the copy activity much. It is going to be a straightforward thing. So let's see how the copy activity can be created. So if you see the second part of this pipeline, it includes a copy activity like this, which will be pointing to the Parquet file that we have created in that first copy activity. So if you preview the data, that file will have all the required user information. It is Parquet, stored as Parquet. So you can see it in the preview that it's getting this information correctly. Now this will be mapped onto a SQL dedicated pool. So we have created a dedicated pool for this purpose. So if you open that, this will actually point to the dedicated pool that I have created inside the Synapse, and I am going to create a table called Graph API data on the fly. So that's why I have given the edit option and just typed in the name of that table. And if you go to the pipeline and see that, you can see that we are setting the auto create table option to true. This is because the table has to be created on the fly. We don't have a table already created. So it will automatically create the table based on the column information that it gets from the Parquet file. And Parquet always stores metadata information along with its columns. Now if you go to the mapping tab, you can see that the columns from the Parquet file, once you import the schema, will be automatically mapped to the corresponding columns in your Azure table. So once you have this setup, there is nothing else that you are using like fancy here. The only thing is that you can like choose what option you need to choose. You can use either copy command or polybase or bulk insert. So here I am using polybase, which is the fastest of all the things. And because you are using polybase, it's always better to set a staging environment. In some cases it's mandated, but it's always better to set a staging. So you need to set a staging account here so that polybase can use the staging for creating the temporary objects and for doing the data type conversions and similar type of activities. So when you do a validation, if you have not set the staging and if it requires it, it will automatically give you a warning telling that for using polybase you need to set up the staging information. So that will again point to a location within my same Azure Data Lake storage itself. I have set a separate folder for that, which is called the polybase folder. So now that everything is run, we can validate it and everything is now successful. Now if you debug this, you can see that it will first create, let's clear the file also before it runs so that it doesn't duplicate the information. So let's first delete the existing file that we created during our test run. So once this is done, now what will happen is that it will first generate a new file which is of Parquet in our data lake. Then in the second part, it will use the same file to extract the data and put it into the Synapse table. So it has already succeeded creating the file. Now if you go back and refresh it, you will be able to see the new file. And now in another few seconds, it will complete the execution. Now that the execution is successful, now we can go to the Synapse dedicated pool and check for this table. So let's go to the data tab and you will automatically have the dedicated pool associated to it because this is all inside Synapse itself. Open the dedicated pool, open table, you will be able to see the new table called Graph API data. And if you go and check the data inside using select top 100 rows, it will show you the details of all the users. So you can have how many 1 2 3 4 5 users, and this comes from your tenant, and you can have the all the informations associated to the users like their mobile phone, office location, preferred language, surname. If they have set all these informations, that will be extracted by your Graph API and that will be populated into your required destination, in this case a Synapse. So this is how you can make use of a Graph API call through a REST endpoint to get this information into your Synapse table. Please note that we have here used the v1.0 version of this API. If you use the beta version, you'll be able to get much more information like the assigned licenses, etc., etc. So if you want to see what all information it returns, you can go to the Explorer and you can select beta. If you select beta and users and click on run query, you can see that it returns you lots of additional information which you can utilize. Not only the user information but also like hire date, lots of information, assigned plans. So if you want to get these informations onto your system, you can make use of the data user call. The only difference that you need to do in such case is like go to your linked service, and if you go to the graph API, here you are using the v1. Instead of this, you need to add beta, and once you use that corresponding endpoint, you will get all those columns. And once you are storing it inside your Parquet file, then it's just a matter of you mapping the correct columns, selecting the correct columns and mapping them to the corresponding columns inside your table. The table will be automatically created and the data will be extracted to your Synapse or whatever destination you want. And for subsequent executions, you need to make sure that you are removing that setting from your package, because every time it should not try to create the table. So it's only for the first time. After that, you can remove this auto create if you want. And if you want, you can also add a pre-copy script so as to truncate the table if you want to have a full load every time. So hope this gave you an overview of how you can use this graph API inside your ADF to extract informations from your Azure Active Directory or any other Microsoft services which is integrated to graph API. And the details on what all endpoints are available is well documented and available inside your Graph Explorer, where you can try executing these and see what the results they give you before you add them onto your ADF pipe. Hope you found this video useful. As usual, keep sending your feedback and let me know your comments on these videos. Feel free to follow my channel for getting useful tips like this every week. And if you are seeing this for the first time, make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit on the bell icon so that you get notifications every week. Meet you soon with another useful quick tip like this. Till then, thanks for your time.